So this is an example of how you could be misled by your observations and assume that it's a contagious process that passes an illness between people, when in actuality it is that they had a common exposure to some kind of toxic insult that caused the problem.
All at the same time in mass? Okay, look, okay, so let me just play devil's advocate. So are there things in life that cause contagion? Like, let's say, people call it the Spanish flu of 1918. Was that actually a contagious event?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because there is a book called The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Firstenberg, and it describes that right after the Spanish flu pandemic, which, by the way, resulted in 50 million deaths.
Right.
Okay, so that is way, 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 way more than our current situation. But the U.S. Public Health Service, they did a series of 3 experiments with people. They did some additional animal experiments as well. But the experiments with the humans, they had 100 healthy subjects, and then they had several people who were sick with the flu. So what they did is they had the people who were sick with the flu cough up as much nasty stuff as they could. They put swabs in their nose to collect the snot. They even swabbed their eyeballs. So they were trying to collect all of the particles that they thought were infectious that they could then deliver to a healthy person and make them sick. So in the first experiment, what they did is they squirted these secretions into the nose, eyes, and throat of the healthy people. And out of those 100 healthy people, not one of them became ill with the flu. So they thought, well, we need to try harder, and they devised a second experiment. In the second experiment, they took the same secretions from the sick person who was coughing and sneezing and tearing, and they then injected that into the healthy subjects. And once again, none of the subjects became ill with the flu. So they devised a third experiment thinking that perhaps a more natural, casual human contact is required for transmission of the disease. And so what they did is they had the person who was sick with the flu sit really close, like uncomfortably close to the healthy subject. And they had a conversation for like 5 or 10 minutes. I forget the exact time. And then after that, they had the sick individual take a deep breath in and the healthy individual take a deep breath out. And they put their lips together almost as if they were kissing, but no contact. And the sick person blew all of his breath into the healthy person who inhaled it all. And the results of that experiment once again showed that none of the healthy subjects became ill. So I've tried very hard to find additional experiments where they tested this theory about contagion of infectious agents, and I could not find any conclusive studies that proved contagion exists.
Why viral? Because the people are poisoned, they excrete toxins, they look like viruses. People think it's a flu epidemic. In the 1918 epidemic, the Boston Health Department decided to investigate the contagiousness of this. So they, believe it or not, took hundreds of people with the flu and they sucked the snot out of their nose and injected it into the healthy people who didn't have the flu, and not one time could they make the next person sick. They did this over and over again, and they were not able to demonstrate contagion. They even did it with horses who apparently got the Spanish flu, and they put bags over their head, and the horses sneezed in the bag, and they put the bag over the next horse, and not one horse got sick. You can read about this in a book called The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Firstenberg, who chronicles all the steps in the electrification of the earth and how within 6 months there was a new flu pandemic all over the world. And when you hear the normal explanations, how did it go from Kansas to South Africa in 2 weeks? So the entire world got the symptoms at the same time, in spite of the fact that the mode of transportation was horseback and boats, and there's no explanation for it. They just say, we don't know how that happened.
Germ theory has been so widely accepted as a fundamental principle that all of our other scientific knowledge is based upon. There has been no effort or funding or research done to look for an alternative cause.
And why do you think that is?
Well, from the point of view of scientists, since they accept that the virus causes the disease, there would be no point in doing other research to look at other potential causes. And so they spend their research efforts to learn more about these particles that they're calling viruses. And furthermore, the way research is done is that because scientific research is extremely expensive. So there are some private foundations with endowments that do fund a very, very small percentage of the scientific research, but the overwhelming majority is funded by government grants. And the way this apparatus works is that the different government agencies that are part of the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, they have specific research goals and areas that they want to study. So they put out these publications that describe the type of subjects that they want research done, and that's what they're going to fund. So they're not putting out grants to look for alternative causes of these diseases because they're not interested in that.
Just for the record, 1918 was the coldest winter on record until 1938, 1960, and 1979. So people were indoors and lacking vitamin D from sun exposure. As Arthur Firstenberg wrote in The Invisible Rainbow, in 2001, Canadian astronomer Ken Tapping showed that the influenza pandemics over the previous 300 years correlated with peaks in solar magnetic activity on an 11-year cycle. Once again, 1918, 1938, 1960, and 1979 correlate. It has also been found that some outbreaks of influenza spread over enormous areas in just a few days, a fact that is difficult to explain by contagion from one person to another. Also, numerous experiments seeking to prove direct contagion through close contact, droplets of mucus, or other processes have proved fruitless. From 1933 to the present day, virologists have been unable to present any experimental study proving that influenza spreads through normal contact between people. All attempts to do so have met with failure. On top of that, wireless radio transmitters replacing the old wired telegraph system were put up all over the world at around that same time, adding a new cellular biological toxin we had yet to evolve through. To add insult to injury, after Bayer lost its aspirin patent in 1915 and the great aspirin and phenol wars began, chemists were pressing millions of aspirin in powder pills, and people were popping them like candy for the flu, unaware that fever is essential for removing cellular toxins from the body, and stopping that fever can mean death, never mind the other obvious health risks of overdosing on aspirin. On top of that, 1918 was the first worldwide mass vaccination program. Dr. Eleanor McBean, author of The Poison Needle, was a young girl during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. As she points out, the soldiers were getting sick and dying because they were given anywhere from 14 to 25 vaccine shots during the First World War. The First World War was of a shorter duration than anticipated, so the vaccine makers were unable to use up all their vaccines. As they were and still are in business for profit, they decided to sell it to the rest of the population. so they drummed up the largest vaccination campaign in history. There were no epidemics to justify it, so they used other tricks. Their propaganda claimed the soldiers were coming home from foreign countries with all kinds of diseases and that everyone must have all of the shots on the market. The people believed them because, first of all, they wanted to believe their doctors, and second, the returning soldiers certainly had been sick and dying. The people didn't know it was from doctor-made vaccine diseases, as the army doctors don't tell them things like that. Many of the returned soldiers were disabled for life by these drug-induced diseases. Many were insane from post-vaccinal encephalitis, but the doctors called that shell shock, even though many of the soldiers had never left American soil. The conglomerate of disease brought on by the many poison vaccines baffled the doctors, as they had never had a vaccination spree before which used so many different vaccines. The new disease they had created had the symptoms of all of the diseases they had injected into people. There was high fever, extreme weakness, abdominal rash, intestinal disturbance, lung congestion, chill and fever, swollen sore throat clogged with the false membrane, and the choking suffocation because of difficulty breathing, followed by gasping and death, after which the body turned black from stagnant blood that had been deprived of oxygen in the suffocation stages. In the early days, they called it the Black Death. They wanted to direct the blame away from themselves, so they called it Spanish influenza. It was certainly not of Spanish origin, and the Spanish people resented the implications that the worldwide scourge of that day should be blamed on them. But the name stuck, and American medical doctors and the vaccine makers were not suspected of the crime of this widespread devastation, the 1918 flu epidemic. Eleanor wrote, "That pandemic dragged on for 2 years, kept alive with the addition of more poison drugs administered by doctors who tried to suppress the symptoms. As far as she could find out, the flu hit only the vaccinated. Those who had refused the shots escaped the flu. Her family had refused all the vaccinations, so they remained well at the time. They seemed to be the only family which didn't get the flu, so her parents went from house to house doing what they could to look after the sick, as it was impossible to get a doctor then. If it were possible for germs, bacteria, virus, or bacilli to cause disease, they had plenty of opportunity to attack her parents when they were spending many hours a day in the sick rooms. But they didn't get the flu, and they didn't bring any germs home to attack the children or cause anything. None of her family had the flu, not even a sniffle." She wrote, "When I see people cringe when someone near them sneezes or coughs, I wonder how long it will take them to find out that they can't catch it, whatever it is. The only way they can get a disease is to develop it themselves by wrong eating, drinking, smoking, or doing some other things which cause internal poisoning and lowered vitality."